Welcome to Latchkey Legends. I'm Santanu Rahman, and today my guest is Dr. Fred McGhee.
Hello. How are you?
Good. How are you, Doctor?
I'm ready. I'm ready to go. It's Friday. I'm ready to. I got a massage appointment in 2 hours.
That's awesome.
Gen X, baby.
That is awesome. So I always like starting the show off with just sort of the context behind everything. In the city of Austin, who is deemed as qualifying to be a senior are people age 50 and up. And typically a lot of the programming reflects more of the baby boomers. And Generation X, some of us are still in our late 40s, but a lot of us are in our 50s. And so I thought that maybe we could do a podcast because a lot of us are really busy. We have a lot of things going on. We can't come to necessarily the bingo games. So,
Right.
So that's the first piece that I like to talk about, and then the other thing is Latchkey Legends, and that the name Latchkey. A lot of Gen Xers had both parents working, so we had latchkeys around our neck, and we had to go home, take care of ourselves, and then parents would come home. That's why we have this name, Latchkey Legends. So, Fred, I want to first just kind of like, if I could spend the rest of this podcast talking about all your accomplishments, all of what you do, but I think the biggest thing that I just love to talk about is the fact that you're an anthropologist, and you've done so much work here in our rec center area, which is Montopolis Recreation Community Center. That's where I work, and you've written a book about the Montopolis neighborhood, and that is available. So
it is,
and I just think it's amazing that you did all this work. And we could go down so many different rabbit holes, and we will probably, But I wanted to just start off and ask you, because of the theme of this podcast, were you a latchkey kid?
No.
Well,
okay. No, not really.
Okay.
I come from an unconventional family.
Okay.
I have an unconventional background. I'm actually originally from Germany.
Oh.
I'm from a town in the southwest of Germany where the the federal constitutional court is. It's called Karlsruhe. And although my father was an American serviceman, he was already out of the army by the time I was born. I didn't have the quote unquote army brat experience. I was a German and came here as an immigrant when I was 10, and had to learn the language and had a typical immigrant experience.
Oh, interesting.
So, and then, my parents were, to say the least, unconventional. Mm-hmm. We didn't call it latchkey. If I was left on my own to do something, that was just it. Mm-hmm. That was just the way it was.
Yeah.
So there were plenty of times when my mother was working, my father was doing whatever he was doing, mm-hmm. working most of the time.
Yeah.
And I was left to my own devices. But I mean, if you're in public school, and the public schools in Connecticut where we settled eventually, mm-hmm. my father's from Mississippi. He's from the Mississippi Delta, as a matter of fact, from just south of Clarksdale in a town called Alligator. Mm. We weren't going to go back to Mississippi. I can tell you that. So Connecticut had really, really good public schools.
Oh, nice.
In the 70s and 80s. And so that really made up for a lot of it.
So when you were going to school in Connecticut, and you have such an impressive academic background, were you always very academic?
No. My mother grew up in the ruins of World War II. She was born in 1931, and I mean, there was nothing. Karlsruhe had been bombed to bits. She has a 7th grade education, if that. My father grew up in the Mississippi Delta. He was 10 years younger than my mother. For black people in the Delta in those years, there was nothing. But he did set a good example. I mean, he did try, he eventually got a GED, and eventually started taking classes at the local community college. And then eventually started taking classes at Central Connecticut State College, as it was called then, Central Connecticut State University now. And I went, again, if I have any academic inclinations as a first-generation college student, it comes from the public school education I got, especially at Kosciuszko Junior High School and at Enrico Fermi High School. Enrico Fermi, of course, is a famous Italian-American scientist who played an important role in the nuclear program, the atom of the 30s, 40s, and so forth. And ours was one of the few high schools named for him. It was a science high school. I cannot sing the praises of that high school environment enough. I mean, we had our lead chemistry instructor was the late James Cherry, who had worked with the great Linus Pauling at the University of Connecticut, one of the few people to win more than one Nobel Prize. I mean, a chemist, par excellence, and a great teacher. Our physics faculty had an incredible, which is wonderful. We even had a planetarium with an astronomer.
In high school?
In high school.
Wow.
We were at Science High School.
Wow.
So, but we also had wonderful vocational programs. We had an auto shop department. We had a secretarial department for people who wanted to go into that. We had a Future Farmers of America branch. It was comprehensive. We had a pool, an Olympic-sized swimming pool.
Wow.
I took my first diving courses, not diving scuba or anything like that, high diving.
Yeah.
With a 5-meter, even a 10-meter platform. Wow. No expense was spared by this. New England at that time was about education.
Sure.
And if you were in Western New England, you had some of the best liberal arts colleges anywhere, and you had some of the best prep schools anywhere. And that bleeded into the public schools, the public school curriculum.
Yeah.
Fermi's now defunct. It's been absorbed into Enfield High School, but the science wing of Enfield High School is the Fermi wing. They built a new wing for Enfield High School.
I see. So after high school, what happened with you?
Well, I experienced some tragedy. I grew up I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a very rough family. It culminated with the death of my father. My mother shot and killed my father about 3 weeks before my high school graduation. At a truck stop in Springfield, Massachusetts. Long story. I won't go into it now.
Sure.
But that was a profoundly life-altering event. But I had already enlisted in the Navy.
Okay.
So I was in the delayed entry program. I graduated from high school, and then a week later, I was in San Diego, California, attending boot camp.
Let me ask you about that transition. How did you make the decision in high school that, you wanted to join the Navy?
Well, I wanted to travel, for sure. I mean, and television, certainly, and films. I mean, Shogun, the miniseries, the 1980 miniseries starring Richard Chamberlain, was a profound influence, as was the film An Officer and a Gentleman.
Okay.
I saw much of myself in the protagonist, Zach Mayo, a guy who comes from, less than ideal circumstances, from an international background. He grew up in the Philippines. His father was a boatswain's mate, for instance, but he ended up getting a college degree and ended up trying to become an officer. And the movie is about his time at AOCS, Aviation Officer Candidate School, which is actually in Pensacola, but the Navy wouldn't let the producers film in Pensacola, so they had to shoot it in Port Townsend in Washington State at an old Army National Guard facility, which is fine. It actually adds to the movie. The movie Top Gun didn't come out and wasn't even, it was being filmed when I was in San Diego, as a matter of fact.
I see.
I have friends who were members, who were shipmates of mine, who were in the movie.
What? Oh, man.
Okay.
That's
wild. So it was really weird to see that film come out, and especially in San Diego.
Yeah.
I saw it at the Glass House Theater, which is at the end of Rosecrans. NTC San Diego is where Boost was, the school I attended. And the Navy straight up used it as a recruitment tool. Unlike An Officer and a Gentleman, which was a character study. Top Gun, the producers of Top Gun, Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer, just crawled up the Pentagon, crawled up the rear end of the Pentagon, started chewing. They got, and that's real. That movie cemented, several generations of that style of film, of what I would call propaganda films for the Pentagon.
Right.
Okay, even ones that pretend to have a critical perspective or pretend to be in a narrative, like Black Hawk Down. Anytime you see a piece of military hardware in a movie since Top Gun, it's because the Pentagon and its branch. There's an entire branch of the Pentagon that is all about Hollywood.
Wow.
Okay. So anyway,
did you see the remake
of Top Gun?
Yeah.
Well, Top Gun Maverick.
Yeah.
Well, I liked it. I thought it was way better than the original.
The original, yeah.
And Tom Cruise did a great job.
Yeah.
But all I had to do was, when the original came out, as a guy who was wearing the uniform at the time, it was really strange to see the reaction of people to that film as an actual person who understood everything about it.
Yeah.
NAS Miramar, which is, where the squadron was, the fighter squadron, that's, the fictional fighter squadron that's depicted in the film, is in San Diego. Camp Pendleton is close. MCRD, the Marine Corps Recruitment Depot, is right next to NTC San Diego.
Wow.
So sailors and Marines do boot camp right across from each other. San Diego's done a good job absorbing all of those former bases. They've all been decommissioned. Wow. So, there's still plenty. It's still a military town. Make no mistake. It's still, the head of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But So anyway, I was all part of that. I lived through that entire mid-'80s experience.
Yeah. How long were you in the Navy for?
I enlisted in October of 1984.
Okay.
In the delayed entry program, and I was given my final discharge in August of 1997.
Okay.
Almost 6 years of that was active duty.
Wow. Well, what would you say was, I don't know, like the Navy just sounds so intense. How do you feel like it's changed you? It changed you from when you started to when you left?
I was a shy, relatively skinny immigrant with dreams, but not the capacity to achieve them. Earlier in the 80s, the U.S. Army used to run commercials. Because remember, the draft ended in 1973 for a variety of reasons. And, we have an all-volunteer force, which necessitates the military to recruit. Okay, to actually advertise, to get people to come in and volunteer.
Sure.
So, there's a famous Army commercial that would say, we do more before 9 a.m. than most people do all day. There's that. And then, what a great place. It's a great place to start. The Army commercials, it's a great place to start. That was another marketing slogan.
Sure.
I had no prospects for college. I certainly didn't have any money. I didn't have a family history of collegiate attendance. I did get a few things sent to me just by virtue of the fact that I went to Fermi. And, I did take a few college, sort of quote unquote prep courses. Yeah. I was a thoroughly middling student. I was, somewhere in the 55th percentile. So I was in the bottom half of my high school graduating class.
All right.
But at a school like Fermi, that made me a genius.
Yeah,
I joined the
Right.
When I joined the Navy, and I was in boot camp and in other places with like people from Mississippi and Alabama and Texas. Some of them couldn't read. Okay, never mind swim.
Right.
Okay, I was like, blew my mind.
Right.
So, I joined the Navy just because I wanted to travel, and I felt it was a good place to start, and I knew that it was my ticket to a college education. Okay. Which was the goal.
Okay.
So I enlisted actually to go to YNA school, to be a yeoman. Okay, which is a rating. In the Navy, you have what's called a rate and a rating. Okay, your rating is your job specialization, and your rate is what your rank is, E1 through E9 if you're an enlisted person. And I looked and saw that I wasn't qualified for the Naval Nuclear Power Program because I didn't get at least a C in Algebra 2. I had a C minus, so I couldn't do that. Not that I wanted to be a nuke. I didn't care. But some of those prestige ratings, that's highly technical ones, will allow you to become what's called a push-button E4, to become a petty officer or a non-commissioned officer more quickly because of the highly technical nature of these ratings. But I enlisted in YNA school, which was at the time in Meridian, Mississippi, interestingly. I don't know if it's still there. But then, while I was in the DEP, my recruiter, Bill Comp, was able to get, because he understood, because Fermi and everything else, college. Was there a way, to go to college? Mm-hmm. And there was a Navy affirmative action program called BOOST, which stands for Broadened Opportunity for Officer Selection and Training, which at the time was located in San Diego.
Okay.
It had existed at that point for almost 15 years. And it was one of the Navy's chief ways of getting minorities into the officer ranks.
Interesting.
Now, the Naval Academy had its own program called NAPS, the Naval Academy Preparatory School, which was based in Newport in Rhode Island. And the two would eventually be merged, actually, much to my consternation. But Boost is what turned me around. I was academically deficient but what that program did is it had statutorily in policy, what they were assessing was your character, your capacity to work hard and to achieve the standards.
Okay.
And this is the key distinguishing feature of the military's, especially the Navy's affirmative action programs, from other ones, is that the standard is never lowered. What is done is that you will be brought up to the standard, and you will be trained to the standard, and you will achieve the standard. So there's never any question about your competence.
Okay.
The baseline competence, therefore, is at a certain level.
Yeah.
It is not diminished. Nobody who might be ideologically opposed to affirmative action can question somebody who's gone through the military's version because you have empirically met the standard.
Right.
Whatever that is.
Right.
So now that said, the attrition rate was high. We had, when you got there, the Marine, I remember very well, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, this Marine from Puerto Rico. That's saying something because, he had a huge Spanish accent along with Marine speak. So you could barely understand what the hell he was saying. But he said, look to your left, look to your right. Chances are in a couple of months, one of those people will not be there.
Right.
So the attrition rate is high, but, again, the military gives you not just sticks, but many, many carrots. You make it through Boost. You are guaranteed an appointment to Annapolis, the Naval Academy, which has an acceptance rate of less than 5%.
Wow.
Okay. Or you can qualify for a full Navy ROTC scholarship at an institution of your choice.
Oh, okay.
Okay, assuming you get in.
Yeah.
Whether that's because Annapolis requires congressional, all this other. There's like a whole procedure to get into there. But Navy ROTC, it varies. There were Navy ROTC units all across the country, and we were heavily recruited by HBCUs as a result.
Okay.
HBCUs have always seen ROTC as a huge source of cash.
Interesting. Okay.
So.
So what was your journey? 1997, you're discharged. Where are you now?
Well, I'm in Austin. I'm in grad school.
Okay.
Yeah, this is reserve time.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I was commissioned in 1991 and served, did my training pipeline. I was commissioned as, my designator as an officer was 1190. Every officer has a designator. And that's a special operations officer trainee. Okay, so a Navy diving officer. What at that time, everything was combined. The diving and salvage and EOD were together. Okay, they've since been split off. Okay. Much of the Navy's organic in-house diving and salvage capacity has been outsourced. Okay, EOD was merged into the new special operation. This is all during the war in Afghanistan. It's been merged into Special Operations Command. So now we do stuff with the SEALs. Okay. But back then, it was all one. And so you got sent first to a Surface Warfare Officer Division Officer course because you still had to be a ship driver. That was one of the reasons, and that was a killer for a lot of us because a lot of us didn't care about being ship drivers. We weren't interested in being surface warfare officers. We were specialists. We were diving and salvage specialists or EOD specialists. But back then, you had to go to the Surface Warfare Officer Division Officer course in Newport in Rhode Island, and in my case, followed by several more months, over half a year of training in the Navy Diving School, which at that time, it still is in Panama City, Florida. Panama City Beach, not beach, but Panama City, Florida, which at the time was a base called Coastal Systems Station. All of these names change constantly.
Sure.
But basically, my first year and a half or so of my time was spent in training. And then I got sent to my first ship, which was, interestingly, in Newport, homeported in Newport.
Huh.
USS Affray, a minesweeper.
Okay.
A decommissioning minesweeper, the last of the Korean War vintage ocean-going minesweepers. I love that ship. I did. I mean, I was close to home. I was in New England.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was in Newport. I mean, I love Newport. Who does not? Who can't possibly love Newport?
Mm-hmm.
It was like San Diego. I mean, I'd gone to Newport when I was younger in Connecticut, growing up in Enfield.
Yeah.
And we did some visits to Rhode Island. You know, went to Musquamaket and Napatree Beach, things like that.
Yeah.
And Newport, I always loved. So that was nice. But the ship was decommissioning. So I was part of the decom crew for that ship. Then was asked where I wanted to go. The Navy usually asks you. You have a person at the Pentagon called the detailer,
Okay.
whose job is to assign you to things.
Okay.
And they ask you.
All right.
But you know, you don't necessarily get what you ask for.
No, sure.
What I asked for, and this was 1992, was to be in Seattle.
Oh.
Because Seattle was the epicenter of the universe.
Yeah, it was.
My best friend was living in Seattle. He was playing in a band.
Yeah.
He was friendly with all of those grunge bands.
Grunge, yeah.
He personal friends with Jerry Cantrell of Alice in Chains. I was in Seattle at that time because his ex-girlfriend became my girlfriend. So I was a part of that whole grunge scene.
Wow.
I was on Capitol Hill at Neighbors,
Wow.
okay, dancing my ass off without my shirt on in Neighbors, which is an iconic Seattle, you know, dance bar. You know, everything was, you know, it was the alternative of the alternative. Okay. I mean, Seattle, I think, is a touchstone certainly for Gen X.
For sure. For sure.
Just like, you know, the whole San Francisco scene was for the people of that generation.
Yeah. You
You know, the Summer of Love, or, you know, Monterey Pop or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult, you know, 30 plus years later to convey what Seattle in 1991 and 1992 was like.
Yeah.
It felt like the center of the universe.
Yeah, absolutely.
It really did. It felt like the center of the universe. I didn't want to sleep. That was the first time I'd had, a product called Starbucks coffee. Starbucks was not what it would eventually become then.
All right.
It was a local Seattle thing. And I actually ended up getting a subscription to Starbucks. And I used to, when I was on a mid-watch and, you know, on my ship, I used to, you know, dip Starbucks coffee grinds to stay awake.
Wow.
As opposed to Copenhagen and snuff and all these other, and, you know, Skull tobacco, which is not really good for you. Not that the coffee is great for you, but in any case, on a mid-watch, which is from midnight to 4, you got to stay awake. So yeah, you know, I was profoundly taken by that. So I asked to go to Seattle, and
wow,
there was a new base there, Naval Station Everett. There was also some talk about stationing the ship in Astoria, Oregon, which would have been nice. I like Astoria. I wanted to be in the Pacific Northwest. That's just where I wanted to be.
Sure.
I hadn't seen that part of the country, and, you know, but alas, it was not to be. I was assigned to a ship that was now slated to go to a brand new Navy base on the Texas Gulf Coast, thanks to the efforts of then Senator from Texas, John Tower, called Naval Station Ingleside in the Corpus Christi Ship Channel. What a nightmare. First of all, I'd never been to Texas. Well, that's not true. I stopped off in Dallas on my way to San Jose to go to NAS Moffett Field in 1990. I was not impressed. But the prospect of being stationed in South Texas was frightening.
Yeah.
You know, I was an East Coast guy.
Yeah.
This was a major culture shock. I would say it was it was easily the equal of the culture shock I experienced coming here from Germany. There were two major culture shocks I experienced. I'd have to say that one was the first, and the second was learning South Texas.
Yeah.
Because that was a huge learning experience.
Right. What was the biggest thing that was just like, this is going to take a while to get used to?
Well, there was good and bad. What the hardest part was probably just how slow everything was.
Oh yeah, sure.
The wide distances between everything. You know, just much lower, lesser population density. everything seemed just slowed down
Yeah.
to the point of where I was like, this was, it took some getting used to.
Sure.
But, it has its own charms. I mean, South Texas in particular, still on the water. There was a day when I was looking at the morning sky as it was coming up, and it was the most beautiful hue of orange, violet, and over the water. Once you get past the Mississippi River, you are entering big sky country. The sky seems bigger. Spaces are wider.
Yeah.
I had never had it coming from Europe and then being on the East Coast. And San Diego was more or less like that too. Even though it's in California, it still didn't have that sense of the middle of the country openness
Interesting.
that you can get as you start reaching, the Great Plains and the Rockies. So, and then I started meeting people. I started, doing things that a young sailor, young naval officer would do.
Yeah.
I eventually got a girlfriend, and she introduced me to some things. I grew to accept. I've never considered myself a Texan.
Yeah.
Even though I've lived here most of my life now, which is frightening for me to say. I don't. There are too many things about this place that I find wrong. They are anathema to my European and New England sensibilities. That's not to say that it hasn't influenced me, but
Sure.
But I'm just not a Texan. Texans have a major investment. By this I mean ideological Texans in the idea of being a native Texan, which is a colonial construction. Native Texans are the indigenous peoples of Texas, not people who settled here because Stephen Austin settled them on the land.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
and that distinction is tremendously important. That was reinforced during my time in Hawaii, when I was in Hawaii in the early 2000s, where Hawaiians are very, very, very clear about who is and who is not a native Hawaiian.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are people who are from Texas even who consider themselves native Texans who moved to Hawaii, a sort of romantic Hawaii in their imaginations, who try to apply that logic in Hawaii and were quickly disabused of it.
Yeah.
To be a native Hawaiian is to be a descendant of the Aboriginal people of Hawaii, the pre-contact population of Hawaii. And I think that's a definition that works pretty well within an American context.
Yeah.
A native Texan is somebody who has a clear, descent from somebody who is descended from an Aboriginal inhabitant of Texas prior to European contact. That's saying something, though, because European contact in Texas happened early, in the early 1500s. So it's not the same thing to say it. I mean, first contact with Europeans in Hawaii, as far as we can tell, took place in 1778.
Okay.
When Captain Cook, quote unquote, discovered the Hawaiian Islands. So he didn't discover anything, but I'm being. I don't want to get too complicated.
Right.
I want to bog down your podcast.
Right. That's all good.
But basically, 1778 is what's considered to be the first contact. So, but in any case, I don't want to get too bogged down here. But basically,
Well, I'm curious about, you were in South Texas for a while. Then when did you make the move to Central?
I applied to various graduate schools, mostly in the Pacific Northwest. I also applied to grad school. I considered applying to the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and also school in San Francisco. But you know what? I also applied to school at UT Austin. And it's funny, I was at the Tacoma Public Library in Washington visiting my girlfriend. And I was looking at graduate schools. This is 1993. And there was something that stuck out as I was going through the file. I could not believe how good the University of Texas was and how dirt cheap it was, especially if you were a resident, in-state tuition. In-state tuition at the time, when I was looking, was less than $900 for a full graduate course load, 9 credit hours per semester.
Wow.
That included fees at the time.
Jeez.
Okay, I was like, this can't be real. And then I looked, because, I was, even in the 80s, I was paying that per credit hour.
Wow.
Never mind for a whole, it was ridiculous. tuition at Boston University and Northeastern University in the 80s already was in excess of $50,000 a year. Then. It's more than $100K now. So, yeah. And then I looked at how good the ranking. I mean, UT Austin's anthropology department was at like right outside the top 10. It was like number 11 or 12 at the time.
Yeah.
It was like, if I can get into here,
yeah.
Why leave?
Yeah.
Because, look, even then I was, look, I'm a German. I don't believe in debt.
Yeah.
Especially if you're going to take something like anthropology.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about the choice of anthropology. Was that something that you had in your mind, or was that an evolution?
It was an evolution. When I was in Corpus, I had a chance to go to the Corpus Christi Museum. Well, actually, let me back up further. My first, it has to, let me just get to the point. Underwater archaeology, maritime archaeology, which is, in the United States, archaeology is a branch of anthropology. In other places, it's more allied with history. But it basically, it's an interdisciplinary anthropological historical field. I had the best diving credentials you could have as a Navy diver. What I needed was to learn anthropology. Now, my undergraduate degree is in linguistics. So, I had anthropological linguistics training. I took intro to anthropology as an undergraduate while in college. So that was not a new thing to me. As a matter of fact, I tried to get the Navy to adopt ASL as a form of underwater communication.
I saw that you do sign language.
That's right. Yeah. A film that influenced me powerfully while I was in college. I remember seeing it in, what was it, 86? Late 86, early 87? Anyway, it was at the Pie Alley movie theater, a long defunct movie theater in Government Center in Boston. Small theater, kind of like the Dobie Mall here. Maybe 20, 30 seats in the theater. I saw Children of a Lesser God. I started off I had to transfer back to, long story, but I was coming from Vermont back to Boston to go to college. And I started off my first year at Northeastern as an international business major. I just didn't feel that.
Yeah.
But, I was absolutely mesmerized by Children of a Lesser God. I thought Marlee Matlin's performance was wonderful. William Hurt, I thought, was a great actor. I mean, he was wonderful in Kiss of the Spider Woman and Body Heat.
I had a crush on Marlee Matlin. She was
a hottie. She is a hottie. She's great. Yeah. But anyway, that world, and it turns out Boston was a wonderful place to study deaf linguistics. One of my mentors ended up being Harlan Lane, who was at Northeastern at the time, ran his own psychology lab. Harlan Lane is fundamental to my understanding of deaf culture and the deaf community. He wrote a book called When the Mind Hears in 1984. Really the first major history of the deaf. Wow. Tracing its origins from Germany and Europe. It's a Eurocentric narrative, make no mistake, to the United States. And what all that was. In the personage of Laurent Clerc, the Frenchman who helped establish the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, West Hartford, Connecticut. The first school for the deaf in the United States.
Incredible.
It's not Gallaudet University. People get that confused. Gallaudet in Washington, D.C. is not the first school for the deaf in the United States. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, Edward Miner Gallaudet, those Gallaudets, obviously the school is named for them, but they came out of the system that existed in Connecticut at that time. So when I say Connecticut has a long history of education, okay, this goes way, way back.
Wow.
So, I mean, even the school like Houston Tillotson, the Reverend Jeffrey Tillotson is from Connecticut.
Wow.
Okay. So, in any case, because of that movie, I switched my major to linguistics with a focus on American Sign Language. Linguistics in Boston was a tremendously, it's just intellectually stimulating thing to study. Noam Chomsky was at MIT. I did my senior year go across the river to Cambridge, and I did sit in on one of his seminars. His seminars were just wildly attended. I mean, hundreds of people, the sloping auditorium-style seating and so forth. He was at the time working on a version of his syntax called the Minimalist program. I found all that fascinating. I had no clue about this guy in terms of his politics at that time. I was a midshipman in the Boston University Naval ROTC Battalion. My job was to go to college, and that was it. I had no clue about Chomsky's political activism whatsoever.
Yeah.
I was utterly blind and deaf, and dumb about it. That came later. I had wonderful teachers. It was just a great, great, stimulating experience. I did wonder, though, why a couple of, like my symbolic logic professor and a couple of other professors looked at me kind of funny whenever I would wear my uniform to class. They were former students of Chomsky's who were radicals, like him, quote unquote radicals.
Yeah.
Okay, and they saw the military thing I represented. They just kind of were put off by it. Which I look back on that in hindsight and laugh.
Yeah.
It's so funny to me. But
so linguistics was sort of your pathway into anthropology.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to do underwater, basically, I had made up my mind when I decided that I was going to leave the Navy, least active duty, and go to graduate school. That I wanted a career change. When I submitted my resignation, I wanted to become a scholar, a traveler, continue those things, but not within a military context. I didn't need the military to be, an international scholar, as it were. The School for Underwater Archaeology in Texas, at the time, and to a certain extent still today, is the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M in College Station.
Oh.
That's because of George Bass, who was very much alive at the time. And Tony Carroll and Don Keefe were at the Corpus Christi Museum. They're two marine archaeologists who were based at that museum for many years. Also based at a museum in Turks and Caicos.
Yeah.
I met with them and we had a good conversation. I was in the Navy at the time, and they counseled me, and they were like, "Look, you can do either. The truth is you don't really need diving training. So I did do a visit to College Station, to Texas A&M, but I was turned off because I was a naval officer at the time, and this Texas A&M is a training place for naval officers. It reminded me of a classic Southern residential military academy school. I was not interested in doing that. I didn't need to play military. I was in the military.
Yeah, you already,
And I wanted, to be in a place that had more of a hippie vibe, which at that time was UT. UT was the school for the artists and the social scientists and the humanities people. And also it was more highly ranked. So I never bothered applying to Texas A&M. My visit there, I met with Fred Hocker, who was very nice to me. And basically told me, said, I get what you're saying, but if you come here, basically you'll be in the Mediterranean, you'll be in Turkey, diving, doing research. You only have to be here for certain times of the year. You could be out in the field in the Mediterranean.
Right.
And I like the Mediterranean, make no mistake.
Sure.
But I wasn't interested in doing classical archaeology.
Yeah.
That's what that's called. When you study, Egypt, and I like it now, but at the time I was not interested in that.
Yeah, it looked like you were wanting something a little bit different, And in UT Austin, what year are we talking about for graduate
95.
school?
I started in August of 95, moved up from Corpus Christi, bought a condo here, started grad school. And eventually I gravitated towards the African diaspora program.
Okay.
What really sealed the deal for me, there's a couple of things. First of all, I was accepted to UT. One of the reasons I was accepted is because of the head of African American Studies at the time, Sheila Walker. Ted Gordon was still an assistant professor. He was just working his way to associate professorship status. He came to UT in the late 80s, early 90s, I believe. So, he wasn't the establishment figure that he would become later.
Yeah.
Sheila Walker was. And Sheila liked me. She thought I had an exotic background. A military guy, so forth and so on. But the biggest thing that really pulled me over was she also organized an international conference with UNESCO. I believe it was in 1996, called the African Diaspora in the Modern World. And she got people from everywhere in the diaspora to come to this thing. It was unbelievable. The DJ for the event was Georges Collinet from Afropop Worldwide.
Wow.
I don't know if you listened to that program. It's amazing. And these were diplomats. These were fellow academics, people from all over the world, mainly because of the UNESCO moniker. And the UT rolled out the red carpet for them. And I was like, I also bartended the Carnaval Brasileiro that year.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I got a job. This is when it was still in the old City Coliseum. On Auditorium Shore, what's now known as Auditorium Shores. But this was a different city. This was a different Austin at that time.
Yeah.
But I have a bartending background, so I got a job bartending that event, and that was cool. That was a lot of fun. So, and there were a lot of Brazilians. I fell in with my friends within the anthropology department. Some of them were Luso-Iberian specialists. And very just the Brazil crowd. Also, I was a soccer player then, so there were a lot of wonderful ways, a lot of things, both big and small, that led me in the direction of going to Ted Gordon and basically saying, okay, what do I have to do to affiliate with your programs? Like basically nothing. I mean, just tell me what you want to do.
Yeah.
And I did. I mean, my goal was to get a PhD in anthropology and become an underwater archaeologist.
Yeah.
Maritime archaeologist.
Yeah.
Work on slave ships. That, and, I wrote my dissertation on the slave trade into Texas.
Wow.
Slavery and slave trading in 19th century Texas. Which led me to focus not necessarily on the transatlantic slave trade. The sort of the holy grail then, and to a certain extent still now, is to find an extant vessel or shipwreck that was in the trade. There's very few. The Henrietta Marie is one. The Fredensborg is another. These are shipped. Maybe the Wida, which is off the coast of Massachusetts, right, Cape Cod. Henrietta Marie was found off of Key West, Florida.
Yeah.
So the transatlantic slave trade, certainly important, but what you really realize if you study the history of slavery in Texas is you need to focus on the internal slave trade. You need to focus on slaves that were brought here in the 19th century from upper South states like Virginia and the Carolinas and places like that to states like Louisiana and Texas. It's sometimes called the Second Middle Passage. And that's what the focus of my scholarship then was.
And this was your dissertation.
Yeah, this is my doctoral dissertation.
Doctoral dissertation.
And what I was doing, I was kind of a unicorn in the anthropology department. Oops. Oh boy. I really was. I was a unicorn. I mean, nobody was studying what I was studying.
Yeah.
If you were, a person who was being mentored by Ted Gordon, you were probably in Nicaragua.
Yeah.
Something like that, because that was his expertise. He spent 10 years plus in Bluefields working with English-speaking Nicaraguan Creole populations.
Yeah.
Of course, Spanish too, but.
Right.
And I wasn't interested in working in Garifuna populations. I wanted to do my own thing. And also, you have to be practical. That's my undergraduate education and my German nature coming out too. UT at that time was all about every place but Texas.
Interesting.
Okay. To be a school with an international reputation, even if you had like a Latin American center like UT had, you went to Argentina, you went to Chile, you did things like that.
Yeah.
Texas was understudied, in my judgment, at the time, using some of the theoretical tools that were very popular in leather-coated campuses at the time, such as, post-colonial theory, which I sought to apply to Texas history. That theory runs through people like Chomsky and Edward Said, but I also cite the work of people like, Manning Marable and others. Classic African-American studies people. I cite Du Bois's his own dissertation. Du Bois's 1895 dissertation at Harvard was about the suppression of the African slave trade to the United States and has wonderful insights.
Yeah.
My dissertation breaks a lot of new ground. One of the things I do is I talk about a narrative, a slave narrative, not a slave, a narrative of a captain, similar to the narrative that led to the Amazing Grace thing. the narrative of Richard Drake, a slave smuggler who smuggled African slaves into Texas via Roatan and Ulithi and places in Honduras and elsewhere, and dropped them off along Padre Island for eventual smuggling into the United States and Texas. His narrative, his deathbed narrative, was called Revelations of a Slave Smuggler. It had been largely forgotten.
Wow.
Still largely forgotten. Nobody really works with it.
Yeah.
You know, but there have been people who've used it since.
Yeah.
You know, but there's still a lot of stuff. I mean, if I were to turn that into a book, I never really turned it into a book. My book on it is just a reprint of my dissertation.
Your dissertation, yeah.
Which reads like a book.
Sure.
But there's been a lot of scholarship since.
Yeah.
But again, because I'm not in academia and because I am who I am, and I'm usually not cited as an African American pioneer in this aspect of Texas history, but that's okay. I'm out in the streets. I'm not in the suites.
Yeah.
These people, they can do what they do. They can cite each other.
Right.
The streets know.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'm out in the streets.
Yes. So before we sign off, as in the whole theme of Gen X, I have to ask you, because you were rapping right before we started. Like, what's your choice of music these days? What do you listen to these days?
Well, I'm the music of the 70s and 80s.
Yes, me too.
I can't listen to today's music. What's going on today is not music. What's music to me is Earth, Wind, and Fire.
There you go.
Steely Dan.
There you go.
Doobie Brothers. Santana.
Now, were you listening to hip hop in the 90s? Like, because that was
my military period. Not really.
No? Okay.
That's when it became corporate hip hop,
mainly
because of Sean Combs and Russell Simmons.
Mm-hmm.
The 80s, the 70s and 80s were the flowering period. I'll give a good analogy or just a story about this. In the early to mid 80s, there was a series of movies that came out that purported to show hip hop culture, the break dancing, the graffiti, the hip hop and so forth, MCing as it was called. And those were the break-in films.
Yeah.
Break-in 1, Break-in 2, Break-in 2, Electric Boogaloo, all this other stuff. But, those are corporate products. Mm-hmm. There was another series of films, well, actually, it's really only one film, and it was produced and funded mainly by Harry Belafonte, called Beat Street.
Beat Street, the king of the beats. Yeah.
Beat Street is a far more authentic depiction of what life in the Bronx and Brooklyn, Queens was like at that time. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't as commercially successful. Right. That said, I mean, the break-in films were crossover films. Yeah. White kids saw that. And they were like, oh, wow. It led to, some kid in the Midwest in Iowa wanting to learn, how to do, blocking and popping and this kind of thing.
Did you ever see Crush Groove?
Of course I saw Crush Groove. That's because Sheila E's in it. Yeah. Sheila E's a fine woman. My crushes in the 80s were, Sheila, of course, but Sade.
Oh, there you go.
Sade is my alpha. She's my omega. I would, as the old saying goes, I would drink a tub of her bath water. I would slide down a slide full of razor blades into a vat and a pit of nails. Okay. I mean, she took my breath away. Yeah. She takes my breath away. But I got lucky. I married a woman who takes my breath away too. I got lucky, man.
There you go.
I did well. I got lucky. But Sade, one of my favorite records is Love Deluxe. Mm-hmm. If there's such a thing as a Desert Island Discs, which was a big thing that Tower Records used to do, that would be on my list. No question about it. Awesome. Love Deluxe is a stone cold classic.
Yes.
My wife and I got to see her finally in 2011.
Oh, wow.
When she was here and played at the Irwin Center.
Nice.
And, what a concert that was. It's the loudest I've ever heard that place.
Wow.
It was unbelievable. And she used it. The band used some of the footage of that concert for their eventual concert film that they later released.
Wow.
So they really had a memorable tour stop in Austin.
That's fantastic.
So yeah, Sade is definitely up there. But Prince, I'm a Prince guy too.
Nice.
I love Prince.
Nice.
You can't go wrong with Prince.
Can't go wrong with Prince.
Funk is good. Cameo, underrated funk band.
Yeah.
Took funk to in an interesting place in the '80s.
Absolutely.
So this is when music mattered. But I remember pre-MTV even. Friday night videos on NBC.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. We didn't have cable, so I had to use Friday night videos.
that was popular.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's sort of touchstones, and music of the '70s is just amazing. Joni Mitchell is just unbelievable. Mm-hmm. Hejira is just incredible. Mm-hmm. Weather Report, that band is just ridiculous. Jaco Pastorius, an amazing musician.
Great bassist.
I'm glad Steely Dan is finally getting some of that recognition that they deserve. Musicians have always appreciated them.
Yeah.
Their perfectionism is legendary.
Yeah.
But now some of the younger people are starting to appreciate them. Yeah. Hopefully we can finally retire that term yacht rock, which which is a corporate creation by some people who were doing a podcast, more or less, a bunch of YouTube videos in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
These people, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker were not, they weren't making yacht rock. Mm-hmm. They were making music.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, but yeah, that's what I listen to. That's what I like. And that's what I'm trying to get my kids into.
There you go.
My younger son, he's kind of into it, but my oldest is like,
Yeah.
My daughter, her tastes are evolving quickly. She's my 12, 13-year-old. She's going to get there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
she's gonna leave the Katy Perrys and the Ariana Grandes and the Taylor Swifts behind.
Yes.
Because those are fleeting. Just the music of today. That's mainstream.
Yeah.
Not good. But there are some bands today that I love. Khruangbin is amazing. Mm-hmm. Khruangbin is a great band. Mm-hmm. They're a Texas band. They play here all the time.
Yeah.
And they do it for the right reasons, and they actually are talented. Mm-hmm. I think Cannons is a good band. Their sound can get repetitive. Mm-hmm. It's kind of weird to be in a place now where the music is an homage to the music you grew up with.
Right.
So it's it's referential to Aha.
Yeah.
And early '80s Britpop.
Right.
So-called post-punk.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting to see.
Yeah.
When it's done well, it's okay. Like The Weeknd had that one song that was obviously an '80s song.
Right. You can hear that.
Bruno Mars, all these guys.
Yeah.
It's funny because Bruno Mars himself is like 40, which is kind of funny.
Millennial.
A guy who's really good too is John Mayer.
Yeah.
I think John Mayer is a very talented musician. Mm-hmm. So, but that gives you some idea of what I'm listening to.
Yeah, that's great. And so you heard it here first, folks. Gen X, we got the best music.
I don't know about that.
Really?
No, I don't.
You think boomers have it better? Music? I listen to full disclosure, I listen to a lot of classic rock as a Gen X kid. I listen to
look, I have a family legacy in Mississippi. Mm. And Led Zeppelin stole the first 5 songs. Yeah. They straight up, that was straight. Robert Plant freely admits this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This music, I listen to the original. Mm-hmm. If you're going to listen to that 3-chord change, I don't need to hear it filtered through Jimmy Page.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
I know what Howlin' Wolf sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Little Walter. Mm-hmm. Okay? All these guys, these legendary bluesmen. Muddy Waters. Mm-hmm. My ringtone on my phone.
Oh, yeah?
Is Muddy Waters.
Nice.
Mannish Boy.
Nice.
Okay? So, yeah. I like Frank Sinatra. Sinatra is a great singer. Tony Bennett. I love Tony Bennett. Mm-hmm. His collaboration with Bill Evans, Young and Foolish. His version of Young and Foolish has never been surpassed.
Nice.
So, yeah, no, I got to say, I do. Johnny Mathis is an amazing singer.
Yeah.
An amazing singer.
Yeah.
Joni Mitchell is great. Diana Krall is good.
Yeah.
Nat Cole is amazing.
Yeah.
Gregory Porter is a great singer.
Yeah.
Howard McGhee, great guy. Miles Davis. Miles, could be a little pompous ass, but he really was all that in a bag of chips.
Yeah,
his quartet, his quintet. Miles. You can't go wrong with Miles. Mm-hmm. So, Yeah, I'm not a huge. I listen to classic rock.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, but I have to be contextual here.
yeah.
Because Irving Azoff, who was the manager of the Eagles and
Mm-hmm.
Steely Dan,
Mm-hmm.
is now in charge of things that are directly influencing Austin,
Yeah.
namely in the form of Live Nation, which acquired C3 Events,
Mm.
and is seeking to fundamentally change Zilker Park into another concert venue.
Wow.
This is a guy who runs, he's the alpha male of the music establishment.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a gatekeeper for who gets to see what, where, when, and how, especially certain types of bands.
Yeah.
He's mastered the business side of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Where Austin has gone wrong is that it deliberately chose to kill its ecosystem for the development of independent artists, and allowing those artists to be able to afford to live here
Yeah.
in exchange for people like Irving Azoff and Live Nation.
Yeah.
That is not growth in my judgment.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
The only way you get growth, you get to thinking that that's growth, is if you think money and power and possessions are what constitute growth,
Right.
not artistic, steps forward.
Yeah.
So to that extent, yeah, my time in Austin has been a disappointment.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would definitely encourage people to support local artists because we still have a few left here, but
No, but no.
a lot of them have left.
I've been in Austin long enough to remember what it was like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Liberty Lunch was open. I saw Terrence Trent D'Arby at Liberty Lunch in 1995 when he was on his Vibrator tour. I went with a very good-looking young lady, and they thought we were members of the band
Oh, nice.
because I had much longer hair and I was much skinnier back then. And the place had barely any people in it.
Wow.
I was astonished by this. This is a major artist. He's now known, of course, as Sananda Maitreya, but even then though, that was okay.
Yeah.
I remember I saw with a friend of mine in 1996. I just happened to go out for a South by Southwest venue somewhere, and we saw an artist who had a hit in the 80s, Michelle Shocked, who had a song called Anchorage. I don't know if you remember that song.
I'm not sure.
Anchorage, a song about Texas. She's from Texas. She's from East Texas, and she was singing about Alaska. Hardly anybody was there. It was like, she was like a nobody, I look at the music business now. I see these festivals. I see these. I mean, there's money sloshing around everywhere. These are institutional problems that are not going to be fixed by consumer choices.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's just the bottom line. There's a fundamental. I mean, they talk about this in Austin ad nauseum. I don't think in an intelligent way. It's a way that deflects from the neoliberal dystopia that Austin has become. It didn't have to be that way. I, among others, tried to tell people that there was a better way. But, look, politicians are who they are. And they're going to enact policies benefiting themselves and their powerful patrons. That's how we got the soccer stadium. That's how we got a bunch of things that fundamentally transformed Austin. They're marketed as moves forward, by the business community, by the real estate clique. The environmentalists are complicit to a large extent, although there have been some who have stayed the course. And then there's the artists. Many of the people who've taken the brunt of this are the artists. Corporate art to me is a form of art, but it's only one, and it's not usually the best one.
Right.
Corporate art is like fascist art. It's propaganda art.
Yeah.
Art is always commissioned, has always been commissioned. This was true, during the Renaissance. This was true, much of Baroque art. If it wasn't for the church, there's a reason why all that Baroque art is in these churches.
Yeah.
So that's not the issue. It's.
Well, I love this vibe that you're generating because it's a very anti-establishment that I think the 90s grunge era and stuff, there was sort of this movement towards indie, and then of course that all got bought up,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the origins of grunge are in the Pacific Northwest indie scene, Sub Pop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Soundgarden, Nirvana, all these bands were independent punk, DIY influenced. Punk is a huge part of grunge. But yeah, I mean, you knew it was over when you started seeing flannel shirts on runways. You knew it was definitively over when that became a fashion trend.
Yeah.
But you know what? Guess what? That happened before. That's what American capitalism does. And the challenge has always been, how can you maintain a certain sense of authenticity through all of that?
Right.
When the 80s is a good example. I mean, when you look at the early 80s and compare the pop product of the early 80s with the late 80s, by the late 80s, we'd had Rambo 4. We'd had a variety of Schwarzenegger movies. The conservative takeover of government was accomplished. Okay. And America's back, I mean, the 84 election in particular, the so-called Reagan landslide, where he crushed Walter Mondale.
Yeah.
And his running mate, Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman to share a major ticket, first woman to be nominated for vice president of a major party. Nobody remembers that.
Yeah.
Everybody was like, Kamala in the last election.
Yeah.
Not only was she not the first, So I mean, that's what happened. So, in any case, I don't know what Austin can do at this point. That horse has left the barn.
Yeah.
Austin has become Dallas.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's I think my big sort of capstone before I sign off. I love what you just said. How to maintain authenticity. That's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, the old saying, it's hard to get a person to realize something when his livelihood depends on it.
Right.
That's fundamentally what it is. You want financial independence.
Right.
When housing costs are low, artists can have the space to work as waiters or waitresses, to pay the rent and pay for food and things, and then to create.
Yes. Yeah.
This is now impossible in Austin.
Nope.
Can't be done. And there have been many, many efforts to address the issue. But, look, as long as you have profit-based housing, that's what's going to rule.
Yeah.
And people are going to occupy that housing who can afford to pay.
Yeah.
And artists are unfortunately, many of them are here actually in Montopolis. Interestingly, a lot of them came here because we are a little bit cheaper and it's the rougher part of town, and I appreciate that. Artists can be a wave of gentrification, or over time, which has been interesting to observe, they can become part of that group of people who are struggling to hang on.
Right. Right.
So it's one of the things that characterizes this community. And, those of us who still are in leadership positions here will make sure it's not forgotten.
That's great. Dr. Fred McGhee, thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
All right.
Appreciate it.